The fiddle stopped in the middle of a measure. 40 people in the Sable Fork meeting hall turned toward whatever had killed it, and what they found was a woman standing alone in the center of the floor, with her hand still lifted toward a man who had already turned his back on her. Marta Voss did not lower the hand right away. She held it exactly where it was while the laughter started near the punch table and spread outward the way water finds a crack in ice. If you've ever had to stand very still while a room decided what you were worth, stay with me through this one. You're with Lone Mountain Stories, and this happened on the wrong side of a Colorado pass in the winter of 1881. Subscribe if you want more of these, and tell me down in the comments whether you'd have kept your hand up or let it fall. She had come into the territory 6 weeks earlier on the tailboard of an ore wagon, the stage having quit running past kettle grade with the first snow. The teamster told her 3 times the pass would close by Christmas. Marta stopped answering somewhere below the 3rd switchback, because she had started counting mule teams, loaded coming down, empty going up, and by the time Sable Fork appeared in its long gray notch, she knew roughly what came off that mountain in a day, and what it was worth. Her father had kept books for a brewer in Pilsen and taught her figures before he taught her English. She had one trunk. In the trunk was one good dress. Dark blue wool, close through the waist, black cord at the cuffs, a hem her mother had faced by hand the winter before they sailed. It had crossed an ocean and a continent, and 6 weeks of road salt had gotten into the bottom 8 inches of the weave where no brushing would reach. Marta knew that. She did not fool herself about the condition of her own things. Sable Fork believed she had come west because her husband died. Naomi Slate, who kept the boarding house and did the town's fine sewing, had that story circulating inside a day, mostly so nobody would have to ask. The truth was less convenient. Ilya Voss had not died. He went to St. Louis in March to buy a press, took the shop money with him, and by August his letters had stopped pretending he meant to come back. Marta sold the press they already owned, paid the landlord to the cent, and read the advertisement columns for 4 days. She chose the one that mentioned accounts. It read wanted, wife, also would suit a woman able to keep books. Marta answered the second sentence. The man who placed it was Wendell Prine, head clerk to the Sable Fork Consolidated Mining Company. He met the wagon in a good coat, looked at her trunk, looked at her hands, and told her most of what she needed to know in one sentence. You're taller than I expected. The company store filled the first floor of the consolidated office block, and every miner in Sable Fork bought there because every miner in Sable Fork was paid there. Marta went in on her second morning for thread. The other women were at the calico, Philippa Scath running a length of saffron between her fingers. Marta did not look at the calico. She looked at the scale. Brass and painted iron on the end of the counter, a clerk weighing beans for an old man in a canvas coat. Marta watched the pan settle, then looked at the counterweight in its cradle, and the whole morning went quiet in her ears. The cradle had been shimmed. A strip of tin, folded twice, tucked under the back edge so the arm rode high. 2 ounces, perhaps 3, on one sack that was nothing, on 1,000 sacks a month. In a town of 200 households with nowhere else on earth to buy beans, it was a wagon and a team and a house on the good end of Fremont Street. The old man paid, and not in coin. He laid down a green paper chit, redeemable at Sable Fork Consolidated stores only. Marta bought her thread and said nothing. She took her change in chits rather than what the clerk offered. And at the boarding house, she put them in the bottom of her trunk beneath the blue dress. Every week after that, she put in more. She asked Naomi Slate about the sewing machine on her 4th day. Naomi was 50, built like a fence post, had buried a husband in the cold fork drift and raised his 3 children on piecework. Her treadle singer was the only machine in Sable Fork, and it lived under a cloth in the front parlor. No, Naomi said. I'd pay for the hour. I know what you'd pay. Naomi went on stripping a chicken without looking up. 4 of you have come up that grade in 5 years, girls who answered a column of print. You get a roof out of it and a name out of it, and then you want to look like you belong in the front pew. She flicked a wing joint into the pot. I sew for the ones who've been here. That's how I eat. I don't want a dress. I want the machine for 2 hours. Same thing, said Naomi. And no. The Founders' Ball fell on the 11th of November, in the meeting hall because the Odd Fellows had not finished their roof. Paper lanterns on wire, punch made mostly of stewed apples, one fiddler, an old Cornishman named Trewin, who played too fast when he was nervous. Marta wore the blue wool. She had brushed it an hour and sponged the hem with vinegar, and it was still the dress that had ridden 6 weeks on the tailboard of an ore wagon. She went anyway. She had already spent 9 months in St. Louis waiting on a man, and did not intend to spend a winter doing it again. Philippa Scath saw the hem inside of 5 minutes. Philippa was married to Cornelius Scath, who managed Consolidated and owned the store inside it, and she had the confidence of a woman who has never once had to guess whether a room was on her side. She did not lower her voice. That was the whole art of it. "Orpha," she said, "come look at this and tell me it isn't roadcloth." Orpha Dunning came and looked. They lined the ore beds with it. You can see where it's been sitting in the wet, there along the bottom, that gray to it. She tipped her head, pleasant as anything. It must have been lovely once. Everything's lovely once. Marta let it go past her. She had been laughed at in 2 languages and had learned to make the laughter arrive somewhere empty. What she had not planned for was Wendell. He stood 8 feet off with Cornelius Scath's hand on his shoulder. Scath was a heavy, mild-faced man who smiled at everyone and never at anything, and whatever he had just said into Wendell's ear had turned the clerk the color of tallow. Trewin struck up a waltz. Marta crossed to Wendell and lifted her hand. "Mr. Prine." He looked at her hand, then past her at Scath, then at 40 people who had all turned to watch. He pitched his voice over the fiddle, because he wanted to be certain Scath heard it too. "There's been an error in the correspondence, Miss Voss. I'm not in a position to marry. I never was." He stepped back and walked toward the punch table. Marta did not lower her hand. Trewin's bow faltered, and the fiddle went out mid-measure, and the laughter came up in one piece from over by the apples, the way it does when a room has been waiting for permission. She stood there, with her hand up. Later she could never explain why she had not put it down, except that putting it down seemed to require agreeing with them about something, and she had not agreed. Then somebody crossed the floor. He had come in late, in the coat he wore every day of his life, oiled canvas, elk horn buttons, snow melting off the shoulders into the boards. Everyone knew who he was. Ransom Devry held the patent on the Long Pass Road and the water rights on the Kettle Dam above it, and no load of ore, timber, or flour reached Sable Fork without crossing something he owned. He was the richest man within 90 miles and, by a wide margin, the worst-dressed man in the hall. He walked out into the middle of the floor. He stopped in front of her. He pulled the glove off his right hand, 1 finger at a time, and put it in his pocket. "Ma'am," he said. Then he raised his hand and set it against hers. Devry turned his head an inch toward the corner. "Mr. Trewin," he said, from the top, and not so quick. Trewin found the beat. Nobody laughed now. They went once around before either spoke. Devry did not dance well. He counted with his shoulders and stood 3 inches too careful. After half a turn, Marta understood that he was watching her feet. "You can slow down," she said. "I have." "Slower." He looked at her. "The soles have gone through," Marta said, evenly, the way she'd have read out a column of figures. "Both of them. If we turn quick at the corner, I'll go over, and then they'll have 2 things to talk about instead of 1. Ransom Devry said nothing to that. He took the tempo down until it was barely a waltz, brought them wide around the corners, where the boards ran smoothest, and held her hand high enough to carry half her weight. Nobody in that room ever learned why the Founders' Ball waltz of 1881 was played at the pace of a dirge. Near the end he said, "You keep books." I did. "I'll want to talk to you about that." The music stopped. He let go of her hand, stepped back, and gave her a nod that was nearly formal, and Marta walked off the floor past Philippa Scath without hurrying. Cornelius Scath waited by the door with her cloak over his arm, being helpful. He handed it to Devry to pass along, and while he did, he said something close and quiet, in the tone of a man mentioning the weather. Marta was near enough to hear all of it. "Survey party comes up the grade Thursday," Scath said. "The Long Pass gets called a company road on the new plat. It's already drawn that way, Ransom. I'd hate for you to learn it in Denver." I keep coming back to the detail of the shoe soles, that she said it out loud, plainly, to a stranger, in the middle of a room that was laughing at her. Writing it, I couldn't decide whether that was pride or the opposite of pride. I'm still not sure there's a difference. Ransom Devry came to the boarding house Monday morning with snow on his hat, and a proposition plainly rehearsed on the ride down. 22 men are wintering at the Kettle Dam, he said. Marlowe keeps the gate well enough, but he's 71, and the arithmetic has gotten away from him. I want the camp books clean, and somebody up there who can feed 22 without waste. $9 a month, paid Saturdays, in coin. 12, Marta said. He stopped with his hat halfway to the table. 22 men is 400 meals a week, and whoever cooks them is also washing and hauling and rendering. That's 2 positions at 1 wage. 12, and I take Sunday afternoons, and I want the coin counted out where the men can watch it counted. Why in front of the men? Because in a month they'll want to know whether it was ever possible to be paid in silver, and I'd rather they learn it from a wage than a rumor. Devry put the hat down. 12, she made him wait through half a cup of coffee for the last condition. Nothing comes to me that isn't wages. No gifts, no goods sent up from a store. If I find a bolt of cloth in my room, it goes back on the wagon. I wasn't going to send you cloth. Men who dance with strangers usually do. I don't buy things, he said, and there was a flatness under it that she filed away and did not open for 3 weeks. Quick word before the damn camp. You're with Lone Mountain Stories, and if a woman naming her own wage in a boarding house parlor is your kind of scene, hit subscribe so the next one finds you. And tell me in the comments, $12 and Sunday afternoons. Would you have asked for more? The Kettle Dam sat 2 miles above town at the head of the Long Pass, a 140-foot crib of squared timber holding back the reservoir that fed the stamp mill flume, the town ditch, and every hose consolidated ran on the benches. Del Marlowe had built the gatehouse himself in '71 and lived in it since. He was small and bent and pleasant, and he showed Marta the ledger, the ice tools, and his grandson in that order. The boy was 11, and his name was Wick. He had been at the collar of the Cold Fork Drift the morning it went up in '78, and he had not spoken since, not to Marlowe, not to a doctor in Denver, not to anyone. He hears everything, Marlowe said. He's not simple, whatever they tell you down the hill. Watch. He turned to a plank nailed beside the sluice wheel, gray with graphite, figures running its whole length in a small exact hand, gate height at 6. At noon. At 6 again. Every day back to October. He's kept that since he was 9. I read out the mark and he sets it down. Half the time he's set it down before I read it. Wick looked at Marta the way a cat looks at a chair that has been moved. "Do you want the kitchen tally as well?" she said. "Or only the water?" He considered her a long moment. Then he picked up the graphite, drew a line down the plank, and wrote a heading on the empty side. She learned the town properly that winter, which is something you can only do from slightly outside it. 19 of the 22 dam hands were paid the way every consolidated man was paid, in green chits good at the company store. Marta was paid in silver on a barrelhead in front of everyone, and by the second Saturday men were finding reasons to stand near that barrelhead. So she asked them, "What does a pound of beans cost at the store? What did it cost last winter? Show me the chit." She wrote it all on the back sheets of the camp ledger in a hand small enough to hide, and on the 6th of December she sent Wick down the grade with a note asking Naomi Slate to weigh 2 5-pound sacks of beans, one from the company store. One off a freighter at Kettle grade before it ever came into Sable Fork. The note came back with nothing written on it. Wick had rubbed a thumb of graphite across the corner, which was his way of saying she wouldn't. Marta went down herself the next Sunday. Naomi let her stand in the doorway a while, then took both sacks, set them on the scale one after the other, and stood looking at the beam. "Do it again," Naomi said. Marta did it again. Naomi Slate sat down on the kitchen chair with her hands on her knees, and after a while she said, "Ezra was on that scale." "The store scale?" "The ore scale. Same building, same man setting the weights." She was not crying, and her voice had not changed at all, which was somehow worse. "He was on tribute his last 2 years. They weighed his ore and paid him on the weight. He came home twice saying the pan was slow, and I told him he was tired." She looked up. "How much?" 2.5 ounces on 5 pounds. Call it 3%. On 4 years of ore. On everything this town has eaten, worn, burned, or dug since the shim went in." Naomi got up, crossed the parlor, and pulled the cover off the singer. "Bring your cloth. I'll thread it for you. I'll hand sew it," Marta said. "Thank you. I'd rather the dress was only mine." She had bought the cloth that morning off the same freighter with silver-earned counting beans and gate heights, 9 yards of dark red merino, the deepest color on the wagon. She cut it on the camp table over 4 nights of lamplight and put it together with a needle, and it fit better than anything she had ever owned, because she had not had to guess at the measurements. The trouble with Scath came to the dam in the 2nd week of December, in the form of a survey party and a very courteous letter. Consolidated meant to run 3 hydraulic giants on the Delphine bench come spring, and a giant eats water the way a mill eats timber. Scath needed the reservoir drawn down on his schedule instead of Devry's, and for that he needed the long pass entered on the plat as a company road, which would carry the ditch easement with it. Devry refused in writing, twice. Marta copied the second refusal into the letter book, and after she blotted it, she stayed at the table with the lamp turned down and asked him the thing she had carried for 3 weeks. "You could have bought Scath out in 79, she said. "You had 4 times his capital. Everyone in this town knows what you're worth, and nobody can tell me why you live like a man who owes money." Devry was oiling a hinge, and he kept doing it. "Corwin Fisk," he said. "Who is that?" "He surveyed the long pass. I hauled timber and drove stakes, and he did the figures, and the patent was his as much as mine. His name on the 2nd sheet." Devry turned the hinge over. He went through the ice at Ptarmigan Crossing in March of 72 with the filing money on him. "The patent came through in my name alone, because a dead man can't sign for a survey. His wife was in Ohio with 2 boys." Marta waited. "I've written to Ohio 19 times. Marietta, Zanesville, Chillicothe. I've paid 2 men in Cincinnati to look. Half of everything that road and that dam have earned since March of 72 sits in an account in Denver that I don't touch. And the interest on it isn't mine either." He set the hinge down. "So I don't buy cloth. I don't buy a coat. I've got 3 rooms up here, and I use 2. When I find them, I'd rather hand it over whole than explain what I spent. 9 years is a long time to be a bookkeeper for someone who never comes to check." "Yes," said Ransom Devry. "It is." On the 18th, Del Marlowe came up from town in a temper. He had been at the Consolidated Timber Yard drawing crib stock for the gate repair, and he had seen what was going out to the Delphine drift. Square sets. 10-inch stock called for on the specification and on the bill, and what he had put his hand on measured 7.5. 7.5 in a wet drift, he said. In December, in ground that moves. Whose mark? Devry's. Burned in the end grain, which is a lie, because that mill cuts 10, and cuts it true, and I've stacked 20 year of it. Marta wrote it down, with the bill number and the date, and what Consolidated had been invoiced per set. Then she sat with the difference between a 10-inch set and a 7.5-inch set, multiplied by the 1,100 sets that had gone into the Delphine that autumn. And she thought about a folded strip of tin under a counterweight. "I'm going to the courthouse tomorrow," Marlowe said. "I'll show the district man the stock. Take Wick. Have him copy the mark." They left at first light. Marta stayed to bank the ovens. At 20 minutes past 9 she heard it, not a bang, but a long, low shudder through the rock under the gatehouse floor. The sound of several hundred tons of the Delphine hanging wall deciding it had been held up long enough. The reservoir ice cracked from end to end. She was down the ore road in 11 minutes. Marlowe had gone into the drift with the shift boss to show him the timber, and the portal had folded. Men were pulling at the top of the fall where the rock was loose and getting nowhere. Marta shoved through them and went down on her stomach at the base of the muck where the air came out cold, because air coming out meant a void, and started passing rock back. Wick was standing 8 feet away in the snow with a graphite stub still in his fist, and he did not make a sound, because he never did. It took 40 minutes. She got a hand, then a shoulder, then Del Marlowe's whole gray head, and he was breathing. And behind him in the dark were 2 more men who were not. By noon the sheriff was on the ore road. By 1 he had a 7.5-inch square set laid across 2 barrels in the middle of Fremont Street, with the burned mill mark turned up for the whole town to read. By 2 he was riding up the Long Pass with a warrant for Ransom Devry. The scene I keep circling is the one on the kitchen chair, with the scale still settling. I wrote 3 versions where Naomi says more, and every one of them was worse than the version where she just asks how much. The coroner's inquest into the deaths of Owen Trethaway and Bartholomew Reese opened on the 22nd of December before a district justice named Holloway, who had come up from Fairplay through 11 inches of new snow and was not in a forgiving humor about it. Ransom Devry sat at the near table without counsel. He had spent 4 nights in the cell behind the marshal's office and refused to be bailed, which the town read as guilt and Marta read as a man declining to look like he was buying his way out. She came in at 5 minutes to 9 in the red merino. It was the first time Sable Fork had seen it, and the room went through a small silence. 6 weeks earlier they had all watched a hem come apart under Philippa Scath's voice, until Holloway rapped the table and the silence became about something else. She was called 6th. By then the inquest had established the fall, the hour, the recovery of the bodies, and nothing whatever about the timber. "You're employed how, Mrs. Voss?" "Camp clerk and cook at the kettle dam. $12 a month in coin. I keep Mr. Devry's book." "Then you're his employee." "I am." "Weigh that against everything I say." "I'd rather you weighed the paper." She had 4 things, and she laid them out in order without once raising her voice. Because her father had taught her that figures read badly when the reader is excited. The first was the consolidated timber requisition for the Delphine Drift, dated the 9th of October, specifying 1,100 10-inch square sets. The second was the bill of lading, signed by Wendell Prine, for 1,100 sets received, from a yard at Kettle Grade, not the Devry Mill, at $4.10 under the mill's standing rate, with the Devry mark burned into the end grain after delivery. She had the branding iron. Wick had found it Tuesday behind a stove in the Kettle Grade yard office, and Justice Holloway picked it up off the table and turned it over twice. The third was the difference. $4.10 on 1,100 sets came to $4,510. Invoiced at full stock rate and paid out of the company account, and Marta laid the ledger sheet flat and traced the column with her finger for the room. The fourth was a folded strip of tin. "Taken this morning from under the counterweight cradle of the company store scale, in the presence of the Marshal and Mrs. Naomi Slate," she said. "It has been there since at least the autumn of 1877, and it reads short by 2.5 ounces in 5 pounds. Same hand, same arithmetic, and it ran 4 years because every man it robbed was paid in paper he could only spend in the room where the scale stood. There was a noise in the back of the courtroom then, and it was not a polite one. Justice Holloway said, 'You'll appreciate that most of the men in this room cannot check your figures.' 'No, sir,' Marta said. 'That's why they've been robbed for 4 years.' She turned around. Wick, the boy, came out from beside Naomi Slate with a slate under his arm. He set it on the rail and wrote, the 10-inch price, the 7.5-inch price, the difference, 1,100, the product, in figures big enough to read from the door. Then he wiped it with his sleeve and did the beans, ounces, pounds, percent. And the tonnage of tribute ore weighed on that scale since '77. He never made a sound, and he did not need to. He stood back from the last number, and a man near the stove read it out in a voice that cracked. And then a good many men read it. Wendell Prine broke before noon. He asked for the justice's protection, was given none, and handed over the second ledger anyway. Kept in Cornelius Scath's own hand, showing the kettle grade yard, the difference banked in Denver, and a memorandum in ink from October noting that the Delphine sets would carry at the lighter dimension for the season. For the season. 2 men had come out of that drift under canvas. Scath sat still through all of it, with his mild face on. And when the marshal came around the table, he stood and put out his wrists unasked, being at bottom a man who understood procedure. Wendell walked out a free man at 4 in the afternoon, and nobody in the street spoke to him. He left on the kettle-grade freighter 2 days later. Holloway held the Platt question over to the next morning, and it took 9 minutes. Ransom Devry stood and asked to enter a deed of dedication. He gave the Long Pass Road to Park County, and a perpetual easement on the Kettle Reservoir to the town of Sable Fork. The ditch, the mill flume, and every household on Fremont Street, free of toll, with the water schedule set by a board of 5, no more than 2 of them holding mining interests. "You understand what you're setting down," Holloway said. "The toll on that road is $9,000 a year." "11," said Devry, "and you're giving it away. I'm entering it in the name it should have carried in '72. He laid the second sheet of the original survey on the table, and the room could see the name written there in a dead man's hand. Corwin Fisk laid that road as a public way. It came to me alone because he drowned before the filing. I've held his half 9 years waiting to give it to somebody, and I've come to think the somebody was always this town." He asked the court to appoint a trustee over the Fisk account in Denver to run 20 years against the widow or the sons appearing, and Holloway appointed the district clerk. Then Devry sat down. Men said afterward it was the strangest 9 minutes of business ever done in that courthouse, because the richest man in the county walked out of it $11,000 a year poorer and looked, if anything, relieved. Philippa Scath found Marta on the courthouse steps. She had aged a great deal in 4 days. The house was under attachment. Her husband was going to Cayon City, and she had no clear idea where she would sleep in February. She stopped 2 steps below and looked at the red merino, and Marta watched her arrive at the only faculty she had left working, which was an eye for cloth. "Who made your dress?" Philippa said. "I did," said Marta. Then she went down the steps and did not look back, and what she noticed afterward was that she had not enjoyed it, which surprised her more than anything else that week. Devry asked her in January, in the gatehouse, badly, "There's the matter of the advertisement. You came out here on one, and it was answered dishonestly. I'd like to answer it honestly." Marta put down the ladle. "I am married," she said, "to a man in St. Louis who took my money and doesn't write. Under the statute, I can be freed of him for desertion after a year. The year is up in March, and it takes a filing and a hearing with my own name on both. Until that's done, I'm not a woman anybody can ask." Then in March. "No," she said it steadily. "In March I'll be a woman who has been left once and refused once in front of 40 people. After that I want 1 year of being nothing but myself, a wage in my own hand, a room I pay for, a name that means only me for 4 seasons before I let it mean anything else." Devry took a while with it. "That's a long time to be a bookkeeper for someone who never comes to check," he said. "Yes," said Marta. "It is." He laughed at that, which she had not heard him do, and he said, "I'll wait." The receivership sold Consolidated to a Leadville syndicate in April, and the first thing the new manager did, having read the inquest transcript, was abolish scrip and pay in coin. The store put in a new scale under glass, sealed by the county assayer, and men came in to look at it without buying anything. Naomi Slate and Marta opened the Fisk House on Fremont and 3rd in May. 6 rooms and a long table, with Naomi's singer moved into the front window for the light. Del Marlowe saw the dam re-cribbed and died in his own bed in August, with his grandson beside him. Wick appears in the county records the following spring as assistant clerk of the Sable Fork Water Board, age 12. He still did not speak, and he still did not have to. They kept the Founders' Ball in November. The hall was full. Trewin had a second fiddle now and a boy on the concertina, and they played too fast the way he always did when the room was watching. Marta Voss, still Voss, on her own filing, in her own hand, stood near the door in the red merino, with the cuffs turned back, and she was not waiting to be asked. Ransom Devry came across the floor in the same canvas coat. He pulled the glove off his right hand, one finger at a time, and put it in his pocket. "Ma'am," he said. They went out into the middle of it, and Trewin took the tempo down without being asked, and half the hall understood why, and the other half never did. Her shoes were good. She had bought them herself in Fairplay, in March, the day the decree came through. She still had the first week's chit. It stayed at the bottom of her trunk the rest of her life, green paper gone soft as cloth, redeemable at Sable Fork Consolidated Stores only, a store that no longer existed, for goods weighed on a crooked scale. She never framed it and never explained it to her daughters, and when they found it after she died, they nearly threw it out. That's the end of it. If you stayed all the way through, you're the reason Lone Mountain Stories keeps going. Leave a comment and tell me where you were listening from and what you were doing, and hit subscribe if you'd like the next one to find you. I read every single one. What I couldn't shake writing this was the second dance being the same as the first, note for note, except that nothing about it was a rescue. I think I wanted the whole story just to be the distance between those two waltzes.